Hello, everyone. It's Dan Gvozden here.
And this is Mark Giannacchio.
And we're here to kind of sadly pass on some news from the world of Spider-Man. I'm sure many of you have already heard about it, but if you haven't, Mark, why don't you tell us what happened this week?
Yeah, we found out on Friday, July 6th, that Spider-Man's co-creator, the artistic genius behind Spidey, Steve Ditko, had passed away. They actually believe that he had died on June 29th and was found by police in New York City a couple days later in his home. He was 90 years old. So we thought we would kind of share, some of our own thoughts and impressions about Steve Ditko and also kind of capture some of the outpouring from the rest of the comic book community, as well as your thoughts. I know many of you have called in, left us some voicemails that we're going to play on the air here. I mean, this is just pretty much a big tribute to Steve Ditko, who I imagine if you're listening to a Spider-Man-centric podcast, whether you realize it or not, has had a huge influence on your fandom for this character. Right, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we spent a whole season talking about, his run on Amazing Spider-Man recently. So if you're new to the show, why not go back and listen to that season, especially episode 9, our Ditko-centric episode where we had 2 great interviews with a Ditko historian, Nick Caputo, and artist Ron Frenz, who was inspired by Ditko's work. And I think they're going to say more information about Ditko than we could possibly say on this episode. We're really just kind of trying to do a small tribute here. So if you want more Ditko information, we got a whole season of it, and I hope you guys would go back and check that out and learn more about the man and his work. But let's start this off. There were a bunch of great outpourings of thoughts on social media, and we thought we would share a few of our favorites from people mainly that work in comics who knew or were inspired by the work of Steve Ditko. So, Mark, you've got the first one here.
Yeah, I think it's just fitting to go right to the official Marvel Comics Twitter feed. They obviously had something out the day of his passing, and they wrote, "Today, the Marvel family mourns the loss of Steve Ditko. Steve transformed the industry and the Marvel Universe, and his legacy will never be forgotten. Our thoughts are with his family, loved ones, and fans during this sad time."
And I have one here from Chip Zdarsky, who is currently writing the Spectacular Spider-Man book, and he wrote, "It's been almost 60 years, and nobody was able to top his original creations. We just keep going back to them, because we would never be as weird and cool and timeless. Rest in peace, Ditko."
Yeah, I mean, what Chip wrote there, I think, is kind of going to play to a bit of a theme of what we hear about Steve. I mean, obviously, as we mentioned, I mean, he was found in his home. He lived on his own. As we talked about in our episode last season, Dan. Steve Ditko was his own man, his own guy, and he's even being dubbed in a lot of articles about his passing as the J.D. Salinger of comics. For those who don't catch the reference, J.D. Salinger was the author of Catcher in the Rye, the very famous book from the 1950s or 60s. Dan, do you know offhand? I think it's the 50s.
I think you might be right. You would know more than me.
Yeah, and Salinger was very kind of closed off and to himself and was out of the public eye for years, even though he wrote what many consider to be like the great American novel. So again, you're going to kind of hear in terms of kind of this theme of kind of weird and out there and isolation, which brings us to our next tweet from our good friend Jerry Conway. He wrote on Twitter, "Sad news. I only met Ditko once, though he drew several of my scripts. A quiet guy, he seemed more distant than intense. Wish he found more joy as a creator to equal the joy he gave me as a fan. What an amazing, incomparable talent."
Yeah, I thought that one was really interesting. I like this description as distant rather than intense. I mean, I think a lot of the things you hear are about how intense Ditko was in his, not only his politics, but just the way he kind of cared for his own artwork. He was kind of the artist's artist, He accepted no substitutes. If something was printed on a paper he didn't like, he wasn't going to go through with it. You know, he was picky and he had the ability to do so, and he exercised that ability all the time. But there is a level of sadness to the story of Steve Ditko, and I don't know him personally, but you know, you read all these accounts and they paint a kind of sad picture of a man very much alone, and you know, I can't help but think about that the police found him several days after he passed, and that in itself is kind of sad portrait, and I think Jerry's right, and I think that's kind of the point of what we're doing here today is like, how can we, yeah, he won't ever hear it, but the world needs to know how much joy Ditko brought to all of his fans.
Right. And frankly, even if he was around to hear it, he would probably tell us we were being silly. So
yeah, absolutely. So next is Joe Quesada. He wrote, "Only a small group of individuals can claim that they have affected and redefined, not just an industry, but popular culture worldwide. Steve Ditko is one of those few who dared to break molds every time his pencil and pen hit a blank sheet of paper."
Right. And our next one here is from writer Jason Aaron, who has not only written some Spider-Man stories, but also was on the main Doctor Strange book. And, you know, it's worth noting here, you know, we are obviously a Spider-Man-centric podcast, but Steve Ditko's other huge creation to the Marvel Universe was Doctor Strange in the 1960s. And, I mean, talk about a weird and wild book. I mean, those original Doctor Strange comics from that era are just something to behold. I mean, really out there stuff. I love them.
And even more, I think, indicative of Steve Ditko without Stan Lee's, you know, like reining him in any way.
Yeah, I think Stan just let Steve do whatever he wanted for that book, and it showed. I mean, it's a really incredible book. I definitely recommend you all go back and read those. But Jason Aaron wrote, "I would have given anything to have lived inside Steve Ditko's head for a day, and he got to do it for 90 years. We were all just lucky to be able to enjoy the fruits of his beautiful weirdness. Thank you for always being you, Mr. Ditko. Rest in peace."
Next up, we've got a quote here from Neil Gaiman, who actually met Ditko during the dramatic finale of the BBC documentary In Search of Steve Ditko. And if you haven't seen that movie, it's on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and look up In Search of Steve Ditko. It's like, 70 minutes? And worth every second of it. You'll learn so much, see all kinds of great interviews, including some that we featured on the show before. I'm sure we've even brought up this documentary before, but Neil Gaiman, the great writer, shows up at the end of it, and I don't want to spoil it because it's a great ending, so go watch it. But this is what Neil Gaiman had to say in an interview with the Washington Post on Friday night. "Without Steve Ditko, there would have been none of the weird stuff off to the side. And the thing that made Marvel was that glorious combination of the Ditko and the Kirby. I was just fascinated by his vision that seemed always much more mundane, much more real, and much more concerned with moral choices than anything else in comics."
Excellent. Kind of going over to some other media here, we have our good friend of the show, Ron Friends, who, you know, I mean, Ron expressed some sentiments about Steve, but one of the things he did in tribute to him over the weekend was he actually put up the commission that we had done for Amazing Spider Talk for our Patreon our subscribers of basically the artwork inspired by our season 1 theme of Lee and Ditko of kind of a collage of that famous scene from Amazing Spider-Man number 33 where he's lifting the steel and machinery over his head and freeing himself. I just thought that was a really cool tribute to Steve and obviously to us. I mean, Ron even wrote at the bottom of that commission, and it was in loving tribute to Steve Ditko. I mean, this was obviously done months before Ditko's passing. So, you know, obviously Ron did that from a place of love. And again, go back and listen to that episode 9 in season 1 to hear some more of how Steve Ditko influenced Ron Friends.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of another friend of our show, Howard Mackey posted on Facebook, just learning of the death of Steve Ditko. He was a giant. A highlight of my early career was an editor was getting to work with Steve whenever I had a chance. He would bring pages into my office and insist on describing the action in each panel. The entire time he was talking, often with gum in his mouth, the only thought running through my mind was, this is Steve Ditko. Peace.
I think we all could probably understand those sentiments if you get to meet someone as influential as Steve Ditko, right?
Yeah, I would have to restrain myself from bringing up Spider-Man. I don't know if you saw Dan Slott's post, but he as an intern got to meet Steve Ditko when he was trying to get him to sign off on Squirrel Girl artwork. And Steve Ditko came into the office and Dan got him to sign these forms, but had to restrain himself from bringing up Spider-Man, which, if you know anything about Dan Slott, that's like a miracle all on its own. Because he knew that Steve Ditko would leave if he did, because he's so sensitive about the character. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think I would be able to restrain myself.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, Dan. When I was doing research for my book a couple of years ago, I had reached out to Robin Snyder, who is the editor of the comic zine that published a lot of Steve Ditko's essays and artwork over the last couple of decades. It was a very transactional kind of conversation because I was trying to get additional research about, Spider-Man and Ditko, and I had that understanding that, there was no other way to get information about Steve Ditko and Spider-Man except, whatever kind of comicalams from those essays and stuff. He didn't talk about it in any other outlet. And I didn't even push the issue maybe I should I've been reading stories on social media the last couple of days about people who called up Steve and essentially got hung up on by him because they were asking questions for an interview. And keep in mind, in all these instances, let's not make it sound like Steve Ditko was this nasty individual. He wasn't. He's basically described universally as very kind of stern but kind, and just very official. It's nope, I don't talk about that. Nope, I'm not taking pictures. Nope, I don't give interviews. But have a nice day, right? I mean,
Yeah.
That's kind of how his whole verb for the most part. So, but maybe I could have maybe pushed a little more just so I could have added myself to the list of people who got hung up on or was told kindly to sod off by Steve Ditko, right?
Right. Nobody would slam the door in your face as nicely as Steve Ditko would.
There you go.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, I like what you said. I want to be careful about what we say about Ditko when we talk about it, because we're going to talk about our personal thoughts on hearing the news and our reflections on it. But I want to be sure that we acknowledge him for the man that he was. He's absolutely a genius, to be sure, but like you said, also difficult and uncompromising, an artistic idealist, but with a sort of sadness and distance that I think could, you could read it as the healthiest thing for an artist to kind of put some distance between them and their work and the public, or maybe even but alternately the unhealthiest thing to kind of be so distant from, the effects of your work. And to that point, this tribute in and of itself would probably be the last thing he would ever want. First of all, it's a podcast. I can't imagine that he was into podcasts, but I was thinking the other day, he was the #1 trending thing on Twitter. What would Steve Ditko think to even that notion? So I just want to be I think re-listening to our episode 9 of the last season, I want to be really sure that we don't glamorize the man. He is a man after all, and I think, and you posted something really nice. I think the only man that could have done Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean, I in the immediate aftermath of hearing the news that he had died on Friday, I put something up on my personal Facebook page where I referred to Ditko. I mean, the word that immediately jumped out at me was enigmatic. In a lot of ways, that works with Peter Parker and Spider-Man. I mean, this is a character. Yes, we love Peter and we love Spider-Man, and he's a superhero, but that's kind of what has always set him apart, is the fact that there's a quirkiness and and something very, he's an enigma. I think it's just the best way to put it. He's neurotic. He's all over the place. It's not, he's not Superman. He's not even Batman, who is certainly a very complex character, but is still kind of a more, I find, traditional grown-up hero. And I feel the fact that Ditko's just his entire attitude and approach to life, when you go through those original 38 issues and 2 annuals, I mean, it's just all over those comics, and not even just with Peter and Spider-Man, but also with the supporting cast. And the villains. The villains are villains that really only Ditko could create, and it's fitting that those are the ones that have kind of stood the test of time too. It just feels right that this is the world that this man created. Like you said, it's difficult to kind of sometimes talk about it and try and not separate who the man was versus what his work was. But I mean, if we're talking strictly the work, I mean, it's just kind of otherworldly. And it took me a while, Dan, and I think I talked about this in season 1, to fully come around to Ditko because of how weird and different it is from basically everything that followed. But I definitely found, as I've gotten older and probably become a little bit of an enigma myself in some ways, that I really have fallen into what Ditko has done, and even today, when I think about the artwork and just the vision of what really turns me on as a Spider-Man fan, I always talk about Marcos Martin and how he's kind of illustrating my dreamscape, and I feel like Marcos Martin is basically just aping Ditko in a lot of ways. It's just something totally different and out there, and kind of it's both bold but also subtle. And uncompromising, as we've been saying.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, focusing on the work and not the man. That's how Ditko would have it. He was all about the work. He was focused on the work, and he wanted you to focus on the work and not on his personality or whatever, although his personality would find its way into the work. And I think, he had some of the most boldly opinionated comics work that I've ever read. Even his, over the past 30 years, his kind of self-published stuff, it's very much straight out of the mind of Steve Ditko and his thoughts. But yeah, like you, Ditko's work, I don't think I would have said that he was one of my favorite Spider-Man artists until a few years ago, but his work was one of the foundations of why I became interested in Spider-Man in the first place. Amazing Spider-Man number 9 was the second issue of Spider-Man that I ever read in a reprint. And Amazing Spider-Man number 33 was the third that I ever read. And both of those really blew me away. And as much as I reread my first comic, Amazing Spider-Man 375, once I got past that, issue 33 was the one that I kept coming back to over and over and over again.
And we talked about this in season 1, obviously. So let's but we can obviously bring it up again here because it's fitting. I mean, when you talk about Amazing Spider-Man number 33, you always come back to the sequence, with Spider-Man and the tons of debris and machinery. Someone had shared it on Twitter Friday. I actually put it up on my personal Facebook page, just those 4 pages. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here, Dan, but I cannot think of a greater example of sequential art in the superhero medium. I mean, just what is captured on those 4 pages and panel after panel of this struggle. It's just, you can't find that anywhere else. I don't even know. And it's not that it's the most glamorous artwork, but just like I said, in terms of sequential art and what this medium is, it's just the quintessential example of it for me.
Yeah. I was thinking about that issue over the past few days, and I was thinking, everybody talks about the lifting sequence for good reason, but as a kid, the sequence that stuck with me the most, other than that sequence, was the one where Spider-Man, who's on the brink of exhaustion, having already defeated Ock's goons by swinging his arms around, is still swinging his arms into the air and hitting nobody, unwilling to give up. And I was thinking about that this week because I think it's kind of a fitting sequence for Ditko himself, who, even at the age of 90, was still producing comics. He just finished a Kickstarter a couple months ago, and I'm expecting his final comic in the mail any day now because Robin Snyder, who you mentioned before, had just shipped it out. And I, I was looking at the Kickstarter today to see like if they had updated it now that Ditko had passed away, if there was going to be a delay or something. And the most recent update on the Kickstarter said, well, what's next? We've got a big bang, a big surprise coming for you, later with our next book. And it's like, this guy, he just passed away, but we've got, he was still working on something. Like, I don't know any comics creators that are in their 90s working on books.
Right. And in terms of what's next, you have a little personal anecdote about what's next in terms of your relationship with Steve, right?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned on the show that I wrote a letter to Ditko, asking him about, telling him how much I loved his work and all that kind of typical stuff, and asking him, telling him that he inspired me, but asking like what were his inspirations. And he wrote this back to me, and it's been really sticking with me this week. He wrote, "I never kept any kind of record of what inspired me or directed me to one area or another. The one thing in doing comic books is that the past work is irrelevant. As a freelancer, my focus is on what next." And I can't stop thinking about that, what next, because, I consider myself an artist in some ways. And, there's that kind of drive to produce and create content that you have. And this man managed to maintain that as a freelance artist into his 90s. Even this was in November when he mailed me this. This whole idea, what's next for Steve Ditko? And, that kind of passion and that kind of love for the medium being extinguished, it is sad, but also inspiring.
Absolutely. Dan, was there anything, I mean, again, we're Spider-Man people. We talk about Spider-Man, and obviously Steve Ditko is instrumental in Spider-Man, but is there anything from not the Spider-Man world of his work that has kind of stuck with you?
Yeah, recently I've been doing a reread of kind of the early years of Marvel and of areas I've never read before in the early years of Marvel. And I was reading a non-Spider-Man book, which should come to a surprise to many of you, I imagine. And it's Tales of Suspense number 41, which starts with an Iron Man story, but then goes to a backup story, which was actually drawn by Steve Ditko. And I just read this a couple weeks ago, and in it, an astronaut is traveling with his spacecraft to the end of the universe, and he gets to this point where his ship can go no further. He's bumped up against the edge of the universe. And so his only way to really get a glimpse of it is to open a window. And so he opens this little circular window hatch, which reminded me of this Roy Lichtenstein painting of the eye looking through the hole in the wall. So it's this man, he's looking through this hole out into the edge of space, allowing himself to peer beyond where the universe ends into this white light that's bathing him. And he proclaims, "At last, I know the secret of the universe." And I guess I just want to say, Mr. Ditko, if you're out there, I hope you found your own portal to the end of the universe, and that you as well have discovered all of its secrets.
Hey, this is Abe Seaman from New York, calling about my memories of Steve Ditko. It so happens the very first Spider-Man comic I ever bought was in, I guess, July of 1966. Spider-Man number 38, Just a Guy Named Joe. And that just happened to be the very last issue done by Steve Ditko. Jazzy John and Romita took over number 39. And I remember the incredible layouts and panels and had been only reading comics for a few years, reading my older brothers, but I was amazed and stunned. Then started looking at the back catalog, reading his Doctor Strange as well, and the most amazing artist, still the most influential, and he will be missed. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Robert Morvay. I come from Chicago, and I just want to say a few words about Steve Ditko. When I was younger, I had a lot of issues in my life, and I found that improving myself and taking inspiration from superheroes is one of the best things that I could do. And comics like Ultimate Spider-Man by Brian Michael Bendis showed that throwing away a parasite from myself to be a better person was a good way to go about my life. And it helped a lot, but the comic that really helped me the most was Amazing Spider-Man 33 by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And it showed me not just to do things for myself, but to do things to better myself for the sake of others, all through the art of Mr. Ditko and then the writing of Stan Lee and Ditko. And I'm feeling a tremendous loss right now of a great inspiration in my life. And I think I could speak for a lot of Spider-Man fans and comic book fans in general when I say Steve Ditko will be missed.
Hey, it's Kyle Kreis, writer of The Spectacular Spider Snark. When I think about Steve Ditko, it really all comes back to Amazing Fantasy 15, and in just 11 pages, he was able to change the world, change all of history, and we can kind of apply that concept to our own art. You know, we for in many ways that was just another assignment in a long career, and you know, we too as creatives don't know when we're going to create that piece of content that will transcend time and history. And he was the greatest. He's the Beatles of comics, and it's kind of interesting that they parallel, and they'll all live forever. Rest in peace, Steve Ditko.
Hey, Mark and Dan, Kevin Ewing calling from Western New York. When I saw that Steve Ditko passed away, one of the fathers of my all-time favorite fictional character and co-creator of the best darn supporting cast in all of comics, I surprised myself by how it hit me. I'm someone who does not get too emotional when someone non-fictional dies that I or my loved ones do not personally know. I was gathered around a fire with my family at the time, and after composing myself, I told them the news that Spidey's co-creator died. Not surprisingly, they had never heard of Steve Ditko, so I told them about the creation of Spider-Man and the type of person he was. Most of that knowledge is probably thanks to the previous season of your show. My opinion is that Ditko's run with Stan is the best Spidey run of all time, and I'll end by sharing my favorite Steve Ditko panels that weren't contained within Amazing Fantasy 15 or the Master Planner arc. All the splash pages of Spidey fighting the Sinister Six from Annual 1, the unmasking by Doc Ock in issue 12, Spider-Man on the cave ceiling as the Green Goblin attacks from the cover of issue 14, and the image of Spider-Man keeping Peter and Betty apart from issue 30. Rest in peace, Steve.
Hi, Dan and Mark. This is Jason. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. My website is Bronze Age Reprints, for what that's worth. I'm a longtime fan of the podcast. And Steve Ditko, I'd say he was more than just a great artist and comic creator. I'd say he's what some people would call an American original in the same way folks like Walt Disney and Mark Twain were American originals. Of course, Ditko is a cranky, randy, and reclusive American original, but he's still an American original nonetheless. When I learned of Ditko's death, the first thing I thought of was Marvel Special Edition #1 featuring the Spectacular Spider-Man. Now, that title might not be familiar, but it was one of those Marvel Treasury-sized reprint books that came out in the 70s, and it featured a tabloid-sized reprint of the Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, the classic introduction of the Sinister Six. And this was the first time I ever saw Ditko's art. I was 8 years old, and it blew me away. Just so much action and dynamism, just characters seem to just jump off the pages. And if you'll recall, every battle in that story ends with a full page of Spider-Man and the villain, which was unusual when that story was published in the 60s. And when you see those full pages reprinted in tabloid size, they look even more amazing, if you'll forgive me for using that adjective. And that book, those stories, or seeing that issue reprinted in tabloid size, that was just about the best introduction to Ditko's art that I can imagine. Anyway, thanks for including fans in this tribute episode. I don't have a lot to say to sum up Ditko other than anytime a 90-year-old man dying is not a tragedy, but anytime someone who's left that big a mark on his line of work, his industry, his art form, it's always it's a good time to. It's a sad day, and it's a good time to reassess his importance and his contributions to the world of comic books and popular culture. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Hi, this is Afiq. I'm calling from Palo Alto, California. And my opinion about Steve Ditko is that he's a role model for me. Thank you.
Hey, Mark and Dan. This is Scott McElroy, a.k.a. Dr. _Spidey on Twitter. Thanks for everything you do. My experience with Ditko was in the late 70s. They had these pocket books that reprinted the first 20 issues of Amazing Spider-Man. And they had, this is elementary school for me in the 70s. That was like my first experience with Ditko, was reading those. I read those over and over and over again. So it was Amazing Fantasy 15 all the way to Amazing number 20. So I had a pretty good knowledge of, I just love those books so much. And then later on when I went back and, really started collecting Amazing Spider-Man and all the other Spidey's appearances, I always had those as a foundation for me. And then also those pocket books also had the Hulk, and they had the Search for Eternity saga in there. So that's that's my good memory of Ditko, always laying the foundation for the Silver Age of Marvel. So, hey, thanks for everything you guys do, and for keeping Spidey alive. Okay, talk to you later. Bye bye.
Hi guys,